Our marriage began like a fairy tale, a story that seemed too perfect to be true. Yet, for me, Sarah Thompson, it was my reality. I was just a simple waitress at the Corner Cafe, a quaint little place nestled in the heart of downtown. Every day, I'd tie on my apron, plaster on a smile, and serve countless cups of coffee to the bustling crowd of office workers and students that frequented our establishment. It was on a particularly busy Tuesday morning when he first walked in. James Anderson, a young entrepreneur with piercing blue eyes and a smile that could light up the room. He stood out immediately, not just because of his tailored suit that screamed success, but because of the kindness in his eyes when he looked at me. "Good morning," I said, my voice a little shaky as I approached his table. "What can I get for you today?" He looked up from his phone, and our eyes met. It was like a jolt of electricity ran through my body. "Just a black coffee, please," he replied, his voice smooth and confident. As I poured his coffee, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes followed my movements. It made me nervous, causing me to spill a few drops on the saucer. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I mumbled, feeling my cheeks flush with embarrassment. But James just chuckled. "No worries," he said, his smile widening. "I'm James, by the way." "Sarah," I replied, returning his smile. From that day on, James became a regular at the Corner Cafe. He'd come in every morning, always sitting at the same table, always ordering the same black coffee. And every day, we'd talk a little more. At first, it was just pleasantries, comments about the weather or the busy morning rush. But as the weeks went by, our conversations deepened. I learned that James had started his own tech company right out of college. He was passionate about his work, his eyes lighting up as he talked about the latest project he was working on. In turn, I shared with him my dreams of going back to school, of maybe opening my own bakery one day. "You should do it," he encouraged me one morning, after I'd confessed my secret ambition. "I've tasted the muffins you bake for the cafe. They're amazing." His words gave me a confidence I'd never felt before. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, my dreams weren't as far out of reach as I'd always thought. Weeks turned into months, and our morning chats became the highlight of my day. I found myself looking forward to seeing James, my heart skipping a beat every time the bell above the door chimed, announcing his arrival. It was a rainy Friday morning when everything changed. James came in, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He sat at his usual table, but didn't open his laptop like he usually did. "Sarah," he called out as I approached with his coffee. Would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" I nearly dropped the coffee pot. "Dinner?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "I mean, if you want to. I understand if you don't." "Yes," I interrupted, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. "I'd love to." That night was magical. James took me to a fancy restaurant, the kind of place I'd only ever dreamed of going to. I felt out of place in my simple dress, but James made me feel like I was the most beautiful woman in the room. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. I learned about his childhood, growing up in a wealthy family but always feeling the pressure to succeed. He listened intently as I told him about my own upbringing, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. "You're amazing, Sarah," he said as we walked hand in hand after dinner. "You're kind, and strong, and so much more than you give yourself credit for." His words touched something deep inside me. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen and appreciated for who I was. Our relationship blossomed quickly after that. Every moment with James felt like a dream. He encouraged me to enroll in night classes, pursuing my long-forgotten dream of getting a business degree. When I doubted myself, he was there, reminding me of my strength and capabilities. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. As our relationship became more serious, I couldn't help but worry about the differences in our backgrounds. James came from a world of wealth and privilege, while I had grown up counting every penny. "James," I said one night, as we cuddled on the couch in his luxurious apartment. "Are you sure about this? About us? I mean, I'm just a waitress, and you're, well, you." He turned to me, his eyes serious. "Sarah, listen to me. You are not just anything. You're the woman I love. Your background, Your job, none of that matters to me. What matters is who you are, your kind heart, your determination, your dreams. That's what I fell in love with. His words washed over me like a warm embrace, chasing away my doubts and fears. In that moment, I knew that what we had was real, that it transcended social classes and bank accounts. 6 months after our first date, James proposed. It wasn't a grand, elaborate affair, just the two of us, walking through the park where we'd had our first kiss. He got down on one knee, pulled out a ring, and with tears in his eyes, asked me to be his wife. "Sarah Thompson," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You've brought more joy and love into my life than I ever thought possible. Will you marry me?" Through my own tears, I managed to choke out a yes before throwing my arms around him. Our wedding was a small, intimate affair. We exchanged vows in a beautiful garden, surrounded by close friends and family. As I walked down the aisle, seeing James waiting for me at the altar, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. But even as I basked in the joy of our newlywed life, a shadow loomed on the horizon. James's mother, Elizabeth, had made her disapproval clear from the start. She'd been cold and distant at our wedding, barely managing a tight-lipped smile for the photographs. "Don't worry about her," James would say whenever I brought up my concerns. "She'll come around eventually. She just needs time to see how happy we are together." I wanted to believe him, to trust that love really could conquer all. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth's disapproval was a storm brewing on the horizon of our perfect life. Little did I know, that storm was about to break, threatening to wash away everything James and I had built together. Our first wedding anniversary should have been a day of celebration, a milestone in our journey together. Instead, it became a day that would test the very foundations of our relationship. The morning started beautifully. I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and the sight of James standing by our bed, holding a tray laden with breakfast and a single red rose. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said, his eyes twinkling with affection. We spent the morning in blissful togetherness, reminiscing about our wedding day and making plans for the future. James had taken the day off work, and we were looking forward to a quiet, romantic day at home. Around noon, the doorbell rang. James went to answer it, and I heard his surprised exclamation from the hallway. "Mom, what are you doing here?" My heart sank. Elizabeth Anderson, James's mother, was the last person I expected or wanted to see on our anniversary. I quickly smoothed down my hair and straightened my clothes, bracing myself for the encounter. Elizabeth swept into our modest apartment like a hurricane, her designer clothes and perfectly coiffed hair a stark contrast to our simple surroundings. Her eyes, cold and calculating, took in every detail of our home. "James, darling," she said, air-kissing her son's cheeks. Then her gaze fell on me, and I could almost feel the temperature in the room drop. "Sarah," she acknowledged with a curt nod. "Mrs. Anderson," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you." "Clearly," she said, her tone dripping with disdain as she ran a finger along our bookshelf, checking for dust. James, ever the peacemaker, tried to lighten the mood. "Mom, it's great to see you, but we weren't expecting any visitors today. It's our anniversary, you see." "Oh, I'm well aware," Elizabeth said, her lips curling into what might have been a smile on anyone else. "That's precisely why I'm here. We need to talk, James. Privately." I felt my stomach churn. "I'll just go make some tea," I mumbled, desperate for an excuse to leave the room. As I busied myself in the kitchen, I could hear their voices, muffled but tense, from the living room. I tried not to eavesdrop, but Elizabeth's voice kept rising, making it impossible not to overhear snippets of their conversation. "Can't believe you're still not good enough for you. Think about your future." My hands shook as I arranged cookies on a plate, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When I could delay no longer, I took a deep breath and carried the tea tray into the living room. The scene that greeted me was tense. James stood by the window, his back rigid with anger. Elizabeth sat primly on our second-hand couch, looking utterly out of place amidst our IKEA furniture. "Tea's ready," I announced, my voice sounding unnaturally high even to my own ears. Elizabeth turned to me, her eyes cold and calculating. Then, without warning, she stood up and delivered the blow I'd been dreading since the day James and I got engaged. "James, darling," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "You need to file for divorce. This woman," she gestured dismissively at me, "clearly married you for your money. She's far too poor to be my daughter-in-law." The teacup I was holding slipped from my grasp, shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden, deafening silence that followed Elizabeth's words. I stood there, paralyzed, her words hitting me like a physical blow. All the insecurities I'd harbored, all the doubts I'd pushed aside, came rushing back with a vengeance. James was the first to recover. "Mom," he exclaimed, his voice a mix of shock and anger. "How dare you say that about Sarah? I love her, and she loves me. Our marriage has nothing to do with money." But Elizabeth was undeterred. She turned to me, her eyes narrowed. "Oh, please. A waitress marrying a successful entrepreneur? What else could it be but a grab for money and status? I've seen gold diggers like you before, sweetie. You're not fooling anyone." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry. "Mrs. Anderson," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts, "I understand you're concerned for your son, but I assure you, I married James because I love him. Money has never been a factor in our relationship." Elizabeth let out a harsh laugh. "Love? Don't be naive, girl. Love doesn't pay the bills or secure a future. James needs someone from our world, someone who understands the responsibilities that come with wealth and status. Not some waitress playing at being a society wife." Each word was like a dagger to my heart. I'd always known Elizabeth disapproved of me, but I never imagined she'd be so cruel, so blatant in her disdain. James stepped between us, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Mom. I won't stand here and let you insult my wife. Sarah is kind, intelligent, and hardworking. She makes me happier than I've ever been. If you can't see that, if you can't accept her, then maybe you should leave." Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock. Clearly, she hadn't expected James to stand up to her. "James," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading, "I'm only thinking of your future. You're the heir to the Anderson fortune. You have responsibilities, expectations to meet. This infatuation with Sarah, it's holding you back from your true potential." I watched as James's jaw clenched, a sure sign he was struggling to control his temper. "My infatuation," he repeated incredulously. "Mom, Sarah is my wife. I love her. She supports me, believes in me, in a way you never have. If anything, she's helping me reach my full potential." But Elizabeth wasn't done. She turned to me again, her eyes cold and calculating. "Tell me, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "what exactly do you bring to this marriage? Besides your charming ability to pour coffee, that is." I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation. Before I could formulate a response, James intervened again. "Mom, that's it. I want you to leave. Now." Elizabeth looked shocked. "James, you can't be serious. I'm your mother. And Sarah is my wife," James replied firmly. "I won't have you disrespecting her in our home. Please leave." For a moment, Elizabeth stood there, clearly torn between her anger and her disbelief at being dismissed. Finally, she gathered her designer purse and moved towards the door. "This isn't over, James," she said, her voice low and threatening. "You'll see I'm right. She'll bleed you dry, mark my words." With that parting shot, she swept out of our apartment, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. As soon as the door closed behind her, James turned to me, his eyes full of concern. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea she would dash, but I couldn't hear him." Elizabeth's words were echoing in my head, drowning out everything else. Without a word, I turned and fled to our bedroom, closing the door behind me. I collapsed on the bed, finally allowing the tears to fall. All the insecurities I'd been harboring, all the doubts I'd pushed aside, came rushing back. Was Elizabeth right? Was I holding James back? Did I really bring anything to this marriage? I heard James knocking on the door, calling my name, but I couldn't face him. "Not yet. Not while Elizabeth's cruel words were still ringing in my ears, not while I was questioning everything about our relationship. Our perfect anniversary lay in ruins, shattered like the teacup on our living room floor. And as I lay there, sobbing into my pillow, I couldn't help but wonder if our marriage would suffer the same fate. The sound of James's gentle knocking on our bedroom door eventually faded, replaced by the muffled noise of him cleaning up the broken teacup in the living room. I remained curled up on our bed, my mind a whirlwind of emotions and doubts. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across our room, I heard James's footsteps approaching once more. This time, when he spoke, his voice was soft and filled with concern. "Sarah, sweetheart," he said through the door. "Please, can we talk? I'm worried about you." Taking a deep breath, I wiped my tears and slowly made my way to the door. When I opened it, the sight of James's worried face nearly broke my heart all over again. Without a word, he enveloped me in a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into my hair. "What my mother said was cruel and completely untrue. Please don't let her words get to you." I pulled back slightly, looking up into his eyes. "But James, what if she's right? What if I am holding you back? I'm just a waitress, I don't have anything to offer you." James cupped my face in his hands, his blue eyes intense as they met mine. "Sarah, stop. You have everything to offer. Your love, your support, your kindness, these are worth more to me than any amount of money or status. You make me want to be a better man every single day." His words warmed my heart, but the seed of doubt planted by Elizabeth had already taken root. "But your mother - my mother doesn't know you like I do," James interrupted firmly. "She doesn't see how hard you work, how you're putting yourself through night school, how you support me in ways she never has. Her opinion doesn't matter, Sarah. Only ours does." We moved to the living room, settling on the couch where just hours before, Elizabeth had unleashed her vitriol. James held my hand, his thumb tracing soothing circles on my skin. "I'm sorry our anniversary was ruined," I said softly. James shook his head. "It's not ruined. We're together, and that's what matters. But Sarah, I need you to know that I will always choose you. Always." As we sat there, the room growing darker around us, James began to open up about his relationship with his mother in a way he never had before. "She's always been like this," he explained, his voice tinged with sadness. "Nothing I do is ever good enough. When I started my company, she said I was foolish for not joining my father's firm. When it became successful, she took credit for instilling good business sense in me. But you, Sarah, you believed in me from the start. You supported me when I doubted myself. That means everything to me." I leaned into him, drawing comfort from his warmth. "I just want you to be happy, James. That's all I've ever wanted. And I am happy," he assured me. "Happier than I've ever been. Which is why what I'm about to say next is so difficult." I felt my body tense, fear creeping back in. "What is it?" James took a deep breath. "My mother threatened to disinherit me if I don't leave you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and ominous. I pulled away slightly, searching his face. "James, I don't know what to say. That's your family, your legacy. I can't ask you to give that up for me." But James's expression remained resolute. "You're not asking, Sarah. I'm choosing. I choose you. I'll always choose you." Tears welled up in my eyes again, but this time they were tears of love and gratitude. "Are you sure? That's a lot to give up." James smiled, a soft, loving smile that made my heart skip a beat. "What would I be giving up, really? Money? Status? Those things don't make a life, Sarah. You do. Our love does. Besides," he added with a chuckle, "I've built my own company. We'll be fine." As I looked into his eyes, I saw nothing but love and certainty. In that moment, I made a decision. It was time to reveal my secret, the one thing I'd been holding back since the day we met. "James," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." His brow furrowed in concern. "What is it, love? You can tell me anything." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "It's about my background, my family. I haven't been entirely truthful with you." James's hand tightened around mine, but his voice remained gentle. "What do you mean?" "My parents," I began, then faltered. How could I explain this without sounding like I'd intentionally deceived him? "They weren't who I said they were. My mom wasn't a single mother working 2 jobs. My dad didn't leave us when I was young." Confusion clouded James's features. "I don't understand. Who were they then?" I closed my eyes, gathering my courage. "They were Richard and Eleanor Thompson." I heard James's sharp intake of breath. The Thompson name was well known in business circles. My parents had been titans of industry before their untimely death 5 years ago. But that would mean... James trailed off, his eyes wide with realization. I nodded, opening my eyes to meet his gaze. "Yes. I'm their sole heir. The fortune your mother is so worried about you losing? It's nothing compared to what I inherited." For a long moment, James just stared at me, shock evident on his face. Then, to my surprise, he started to laugh. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but one of pure, unadulterated joy. "Oh, Sarah," he said, pulling me into a tight embrace. "My brave, wonderful Sarah. You've been carrying this secret all this time?" I nodded against his chest, relief washing over me. "I was afraid," I admitted. "Afraid that if people knew who I really was, they'd only see the money, not me. That's why I took the job at the cafe, why I lived in that tiny apartment. I wanted to experience life without the weight of my family name and fortune." James pulled back, cupping my face in his hands. "And that's exactly why I fell in love with you. Your kindness, your work ethic, your genuine heart, those are all you, Sarah. Not your family name, not your money." As we sat there, the truth finally out in the open, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. James didn't care about the money, he cared about me, just as I cared about him. "What do we do now?" I asked, suddenly feeling uncertain about the future. James smiled, that warm, loving smile that had first captured my heart in the cafe. Now we face whatever comes together. We'll deal with my mother, we'll figure out how to handle your inheritance, we'll do it all as a team." He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "But first," he added with a mischievous glint in his eye, "I think we should celebrate our anniversary properly. After all, it's not every day a man finds out his wife is not only the love of his life but also a secret heiress." I couldn't help but laugh, the tension of the day finally breaking. As James pulled me in for a kiss, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Our love, tested by disapproving family and hidden truths, had emerged stronger than ever. And tomorrow we would face the world and Elizabeth Anderson with our heads held high, secure in our love and the truth of who we were. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence of the previous day. I woke up early, my mind already racing with plans and possibilities. James was still sleeping peacefully beside me, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. I slipped out of bed quietly, padding to the kitchen to make coffee. As I waited for the pot to brew, I made a decision. It was time to face the music, to confront Elizabeth Anderson with the truth, and to start living authentically. When James finally emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes, I was ready. "James," I said, handing him a steaming mug of coffee, "I think it's time we paid a visit to your mother." He nearly choked on his first sip. "Are you sure? After yesterday, I wouldn't blame you if you never wanted to see her again." I nodded firmly. "I'm sure. It's time she knew the truth. And there's something else I need to do. Something I should have done a long time ago." James looked at me quizzically but didn't press for details. He trusted me, and that trust meant everything. "All right," he said, squeezing my hand. "Let's do it." We got dressed quickly, me in a simple but elegant dress I'd been saving for a special occasion, James in a sharp suit. As we headed out, I made a quick phone call. "Mr. Rodriguez? It's Sarah Thompson. Yes, I need you to meet me at the estate in an hour. And bring the necessary paperwork. It's time." James raised an eyebrow at me as I hung up, but again, he didn't question me. His faith in me, his willingness to follow my lead without demanding explanations, made me love him even more. We drove in comfortable silence, the city gradually giving way to lush countryside. James's eyebrows rose higher and higher as we turned onto a private road, then pulled up to a grand, wrought-iron gate. I rolled down the window and punched in a code. The gate swung open silently. "Sarah," James said slowly as we drove up a long, tree-lined driveway, "where exactly are we?" I took a deep breath. "This is where I grew up, James. This is the Thompson estate." His eyes widened as we rounded a bend and the mansion came into view. It was a sprawling, three-story structure of red brick and white columns, surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens. "It's impressive," James managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I parked the car in front of the main entrance, where Mr. Rodriguez, my family's longtime lawyer and estate manager, was already waiting. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Miss Sarah," he greeted me warmly as we got out of the car. "It's good to see you again. And this must be Mr. Anderson." James shook Mr. Rodriguez's hand, still looking a bit shell-shocked. "Please, call me James." "Sarah," a sharp voice cut through the air, making us all turn. Elizabeth Anderson was striding towards us, her high heels clicking against the cobblestone driveway. "What is the meaning of this? Why have you brought my son to this place?" I straightened my spine, drawing strength from James's presence beside me and the solid ground of my childhood home beneath my feet. "Mrs. Anderson," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I've brought you and James here because there are some things you need to know. Please, let's go inside." Elizabeth looked like she wanted to argue, but curiosity seemed to get the better of her. She followed us into the house, her eyes darting around, taking in the grand foyer with its sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier. I led everyone to my father's old study, a room that always made me feel safe and strong. Rich mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive desk dominated the center of the room. I took a seat behind the desk, gesturing for the others to sit in the leather chairs facing me. "Mrs. Anderson," I began, once everyone was seated, "I owe you an apology. I haven't been entirely truthful about who I am." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "My name is Sarah Thompson. I'm the daughter of Richard and Eleanor Thompson, and the sole heir to the Thompson fortune." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. James, who already knew this part, reached over and squeezed my hand supportively. That's impossible," Elizabeth finally sputtered. "The Thompsons' daughter disappeared years ago, after their death. She never claimed her inheritance." I nodded. "That's true. After my parents died, I was overwhelmed. Not just by grief, but by the sudden weight of responsibility. I wasn't ready. So I ran. I changed my name, got a job as a waitress, lived a normal life. That's how I met James." I turned to James, my eyes full of love and gratitude. James saw me for who I was, not what I had. He loved me when he thought I was just a waitress with big dreams. That's why I fell in love with him, Mrs. Anderson. Not for his money or his status, but for his heart. Elizabeth seemed to be having trouble processing this information. Her gaze darted around the room, as if looking for some proof that this was all an elaborate hoax. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward then, placing a thick folder on the desk. "I have here all the necessary documentation proving Miss Sarah's identity and her claim to the Thompson estate and associated holdings." As Elizabeth leafed through the documents, her hands shaking slightly, I continued. "Mrs. Anderson, I know you were concerned about James marrying someone you perceived as beneath his station. I hope this alleviates those concerns. But more importantly, I hope you can see that your son's happiness isn't dependent on wealth or status. It's about love, trust, and mutual respect." James stood up then, moving to stand beside me. "Mom," he said, his voice firm but kind, "Sarah is my wife. I love her. Whether she's a waitress or an heiress doesn't change that. I hope you can accept that and be happy for us." Elizabeth looked up from the papers, her face a mix of emotions, shock, disbelief, and something that might have been shame. I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "This is all so unexpected." I leaned forward, my voice gentle. "Mrs. Anderson, I know this is a lot to take in. But I want you to know that I love your son deeply. I've always wanted what's best for him, just as you do. Can we start over? For James's sake. For a long moment, Elizabeth just stared at me. Then, slowly, she nodded. I think I'd like that, Sarah. And please, call me Elizabeth. The tension in the room eased palpably. James let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding, and even Mr. Rodriguez smiled. Now, I said, turning back to the papers on the desk, there's one more thing I need to do. I picked up a pen and began signing documents. Sarah? James asked, curiosity evident in his voice. What are you doing? I looked up at him, smiling. I'm claiming my inheritance, James. All these years, I've been running from who I am, from the responsibility my parents left me. But I'm ready now. Ready to use this wealth to make a difference, to honor my parents' memory. As I signed the last document, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt truly, completely myself. So, James said, a hint of teasing in his voice, does this mean I'm a trophy husband now? The laughter that filled the room then was genuine and warm. As I looked around at James, Elizabeth, and Mr. Rodriguez, I felt a sense of rightness settle over me. This was my family now, complicated, imperfect, but bound together by love and understanding. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges to face, a fortune to manage, a public curious about the long-lost Thompson heiress. But with James by my side and this newfound understanding with Elizabeth, I felt ready to face whatever came our way. As we left the study, heading to the kitchen for a much-needed cup of tea, I couldn't help but feel that this was the real beginning of our happily ever after. The revelation of my true identity had left both James and Elizabeth in a state of shock. As we stood in the grand foyer of the Thompson estate, the silence was palpable, broken only by the gentle ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Elizabeth was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what to say. This is all so unexpected. Her eyes darted around the opulent surroundings, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the priceless artwork, and the sheer grandeur of the place. The look of disdain she had worn earlier was replaced by one of utter disbelief. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I needed to say next. Mrs. Anderson. Elizabeth, I began, my voice soft but firm. I understand this is a lot to take in. But I want you to know that I've always loved your son for who he is, not for his money or status. I kept my own background a secret because I wanted to be loved for myself, not for my family's wealth. James stepped closer to me, wrapping an arm around my waist in a show of support. Mom, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of emotions, Sarah has been nothing but genuine and loving since the day I met her. Her background doesn't change who she is or how I feel about her. Elizabeth's gaze shifted between James and me, her expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, she let out a small, rueful laugh. Well, she said, shaking her head, I suppose I owe you an apology, Sarah. I've been less than welcoming, to put it mildly. I appreciate that, Elizabeth, I replied, feeling a glimmer of hope. And I hope we can start fresh. For James's sake, if nothing else. Elizabeth nodded slowly, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I think I'd like that. It seems I have a lot to learn about my new daughter-in-law. The tension in the room eased noticeably, and I felt James relax beside me. But there was still more to be said, more to be explained. There's something else you both need to know, I said, leading them into the study where Mr. Rodriguez was waiting with a stack of documents. I've made a decision about my inheritance. James looked at me quizzically. What do you mean, Sarah? I took a seat behind the massive mahogany desk, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and determination. 4 years, I've been running from my responsibilities, from the legacy my parents left me. But I realize now that I can't keep hiding. It's time for me to step up and use this wealth to make a difference in the world. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward, placing a folder in front of me. Miss Sarah has decided to claim her full inheritance, he explained to James and Elizabeth. This includes not only the family fortune but also control of Thompson Industries. James's eyes widened. Sarah, are you sure about this? It's a huge responsibility. I nodded, feeling more certain than I had in years. I'm sure, James. My parents built something incredible, and I want to honor their memory by continuing their work. But, I added, reaching out to take his hand, I don't want to do it alone. I want us to do this together. James squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with love and pride. Of course, Sarah. Whatever you need, I'm here. Elizabeth, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. Sarah, she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you my respect. What you're taking on, it's not easy. Believe me, I know. But I think you have the strength to do it. Her words caught me off guard, and I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. Thank you, Elizabeth. That means a lot to me. As I signed the necessary documents, officially claiming my inheritance and my position as CEO of Thompson Industries, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly being myself. So, James said, a mischievous glint in his eye, does this mean I get to be a trophy husband now? The laughter that filled the room was genuine and warm, dispelling the last of the tension. Even Elizabeth chuckled, shaking her head at her son's antics. As we left the study, heading towards the kitchen for a much-needed cup of tea, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought us to this point. From our first meeting in that small cafe to this moment, standing in the home of my childhood, about to embark on a new chapter of our lives. You know, I said as we settled around the kitchen island, steaming mugs of tea in hand, I always dreamed of making a difference in the world. I just never imagined it would be like this. James smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. You've already made a difference, Sarah. You've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. Elizabeth, who had been quietly observing us, suddenly spoke up. I think I'm beginning to see what my son sees in you, Sarah. Your strength, your compassion, they remind me of myself when I was younger. I blinked in surprise, not quite sure how to respond to this unexpected compliment. Thank you, Elizabeth. I hope I can live up to that comparison. She waved her hand dismissively, but there was a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before. You'll do fine. And, if you ever need any advice about navigating the business world, well, I might have some experience to share. The offer, coming from a woman who had been so adamantly against our relationship just a day ago, left me momentarily speechless. I'd like that very much, I finally managed to say. As we sat there, sipping our tea and talking about the future, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, there would be challenges to face, a fortune to manage, a company to run. But with James by my side and this newfound understanding with Elizabeth, I felt ready to face whatever came our way. You know, James said, setting down his mug, we never did get to properly celebrate our anniversary yesterday. I laughed, the sound echoing in the large kitchen. You're right. I suppose we got a bit sidetracked. Elizabeth stood up, smoothing down her designer dress. Well, I think that's my cue to leave. You two deserve some time alone to celebrate. She paused, then added with a small smile, and Sarah, welcome to the family. Officially. As Elizabeth left, James pulled me into his arms. So, Mrs. Anderson Thompson, what do you say we make up for lost time? I leaned into his embrace, feeling happier and more content than I had in years. I'd say that sounds perfect, Mr. Anderson Thompson. As we stood there, in the kitchen of my childhood home, I couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns life had taken us on. From a chance meeting in a cafe to this moment, about to embark on a new adventure together. The money that Elizabeth had once valued so highly was there, yes. But the true treasure, as I had always known, was the love James and I shared. A love that had weathered disapproval, secrets, and revelations. A love that Elizabeth was finally beginning to understand and accept. As James leaned in to kiss me, I knew that whatever challenges the future held, we would face them together. Our love story, unconventional as it was far from over. In fact, I had a feeling it was just beginning.